Haha, very funny. Hello, my name is Bob. Welcome to A Short Stop on Pool. This video is about what I think is a very important component of what we consider to be a proper pool stroke. And it's also a topic of controversy when it's brought up during internet discussions. Today we're going to talk about elbow drop and why it's so important to never drop your elbow. Not this again. You have to drop your elbow in order to have a long, smooth follow through. You see all the pros who drop their elbow when they shoot? Guys, let's not argue. Let's take an objective look at what elbow drop is and then make a decision of whether or not it's something we want to include in our pool game. First, we'll look at a pendulum type pool stroke without an elbow drop and with dropping the elbow. Then we'll compare to a snooker style piston stroke. This will shed some light on different types of elbow movement, and we'll look at some examples from the pros. And finally, we'll take a practical look at what elbow drop really means for your pool game. The most common pool stroke is referred to as a pendulum stroke because it's similar to the pendulum in a clock. The pendulum has a pivot point, a bob. The distance between the pivot and the bob is the radius. When the pivot and bob are aligned with gravity, that's the equilibrium position. Most pendulums describe a circular path, and the distance the bob travels on either side of the equilibrium position is called the amplitude. Now let's translate these terms to a pool shooter. Here I am at address position. Address is when you first get down on the shot and position your Q-tip at the cue ball. The pivot point is my elbow. The bob is where my hand grips the cue. Radius is the length of my forearm. The equilibrium is the angle of my forearm when the Q-tip is at address. And the amplitude is how far my hand moves on the backstroke and on the forward stroke. The pendulum stroke analogy is apt and accurate given that the elbow remains fixed. Then the grip hand will always be at its lowest point at address and will be higher both on the backstroke and on the forward stroke, the follow-through. But that's where the similarities between a clock and a pool player probably end. One important difference is that the address position of the forearm is often not at 90 degrees to gravity. Now it looks like that's where I'm positioning my forearm in this photograph, but most pool players will position their forearm at 90 degrees to their cue. This means that the lowest part of your pendulum will be either just at impact with the cue ball or just past it. This is a minor difference, and only you can decide if that difference is impactful to your stroke. Another difference in the analogy is that clocks don't have a fulcrum, and that's what our pool cue is. And we have to use a bridge which becomes a second pivot point. This means that as the butt of your cue rises up on your backstroke, the tip of your cue will move downward, and we're going to take a closer look at this in just a minute. A third difference is that our elbow joint does not function like the pin joint of a clock. Stroking your pool cue would be easier if it was, but the elbow joint is capable of a much wider range of motion than we pool players need. Additionally, the flexibility of the bones, cartilage, and tendons in our elbows and wrists means that the forearm length isn't necessarily consistent all the way through the pool stroke. That said, let's take a look at the mechanics of a typical pendulum stroke with no elbow drop, and then later we'll compare to other types of strokes. First, I think it's important to note that your forearm position and bridge length are a team. In other words, if you're shooting a shot with a shorter bridge, that means your grip position should move forward. And if you're shooting with a longer bridge, your grip should move towards the back end of the cue. Though some players prefer to shoot with the same bridge length on all shots. So keep that in mind. Bridge length's going to come up again in a moment. Let's transition to a split screen so we can take a close look at the Q-tip and cue ball. I've drawn yellow lines and an arrow to mark the position of my elbow and upper arm, pool cue, and the first finger of my grip hand at my initial address position. On the bottom of the screen, a yellow dot marks my starting Q-tip position. Halfway through my first backstroke, we can see that the butt of the cue has not risen and the Q-tip has not dropped from the plane of the cue. At the end of the backstroke, we can see that the butt of the cue has risen a little and the Q-tip has dipped just a bit in proportion while the elbow still has not moved. I've added a yellow arrow to mark the position of my grip at the back of the backstroke. On my first return to address position, aside from the fact that my Q-tip didn't come forward quite as far as it should have, we can see that the butt of the cue and my elbow have both dropped just a tiny little bit. I don't think you would even notice that if you were watching a player in real time, but it's something I'm going to pay attention to when I practice. On my second backstroke, my elbow has not moved. The butt of the cue has come back like the first one, but I've drawn the cue stick back just a little bit farther than the first backstroke. Everything pretty close to optimal so far. Forward position of my second warm-up stroke, the cue tip came forward just a bit more. Elbow hasn't moved, still looking good. Though the butt of the cue and my elbow are just a bit lower than the initial set position again. Everything pretty much the same for my third warm-up stroke, and then a nice long hesitation before the final stroke. A slower backstroke this time, but the elbow, butt of the cue, and the tip are in the same position as my warm-up strokes. Notice as my cue passes through the address point again, my elbow is back to the original start position. At the end of the follow-through, notice that my elbow has not dropped. The butt of the cue and my grip hand are now above the address position of the cue, and the cue tip is now in touch with the table. The cue tip has dropped because the butt of the cue has risen. There's two important points that I'll make note of and compare to other types of strokes. The first is that we've always been taught to shoot with as level of a cue as possible. Well, perfectly level is not possible because that would be parallel to the surface of the table and the rail is in the way on most every shot. So what we're really striving to achieve is to have the cue in the same position at impact as at address. And that was achieved with this stroke. The second thing to note is the length of follow-through. And if you compare to this image of where the cue ball was, there was about 5 to 6 inches of follow-through, and that's with a 9-inch bridge. Now you're going to see variation then in that depending on how long your bridge is and how tall you are, how long your forearm is. But keep those two things in mind as we look at some other strokes. This next stroke is also a pendulum stroke, and I'll just let the warm-ups play at about half speed, but then I'll pause it at the follow-through when I drop my elbow. Right here I'm delivering my cue and the tip is back at the address position. You can see that my elbow has not dropped at all, unless if it's just that tiny bit like we saw last time. Now I'm going to advance the video just 2 frames, and that's 1/30th of a second. Now you can see the cue tip has contacted the cue ball, and the cue ball is beginning to take off, and my elbow has dropped a bit more. Let's go 1/30th of a second further. Now we can see that my elbow is dipped only just a tiny bit more. My follow-through is about 5 inches long maybe right now, and the cue tip has not dropped toward the table. Okay, let's complete the follow-through. Here I've followed through at least 9 inches, maybe 10 inches. You can see that the elbow has dropped dramatically and the shoulder has also dropped as well. Let's compare the moment of impact with the address point as well. You might not notice a difference, but let me put up the images for impact and address when I did not drop my elbow. At bottom left is the moment of impact when I dropped my elbow, and because the elbow dropped, the tip was higher than it was at address. Whereas when I didn't drop my elbow, the impact point was the same. It's my opinion, and it's based largely on my own experience, that the desire for a level cue, or as level as you can get during the follow-through, is what provides the motivation for dropping the elbow. But as you see here, dropping your elbow can have a negative impact on your cue tip placement. And if we look at the instant 1/30th of a second after cue ball impact, the cue ball is gone. And so we have to ask ourselves, what are the drawbacks and the benefits of dropping our elbow and following through another 5 inches? Before we attempt to answer that, let's take a look at what could be involved in the piston style pool stroke. The piston of an engine travels in a perfectly straight line as it's fitted tight to the walls of the cylinder. Likewise, with a piston-style pool stroke, the butt and tip of the cue do not move up and down appreciably anywhere during the backstroke or follow-through. Let me introduce you to Steve Barton, a top snooker coach in England. He has an excellent YouTube channel. Even if you don't play snooker, as a pool player, you'll pick up lots of great advice, and I'll leave a link to his channel in the description. Unlike pool players, snooker players are taught to have 4 points of contact with the cue: the bridge, the chin, the chest, and the grip hand. You can see how that's going to help with the piston-like action of the cue. And in fact, imagine if the grip hand were to rise up on the follow-through, the chin is going to help to keep the cue down. Here's Steve at address position, again a yellow line indicating his elbow position, an arrow pointing to the grip, and another yellow line showing the position of his cue. Now, with the pendulum stroke, the goal was to always have the cue tip return to the address position at the bottom of the pendulum. The piston type stroke, on the other hand, keeps the cue tip at the address position by always trying to keep the cue on that line. This is the back of Steve's first backstroke, or feathers as they call them in England, and that is the full backstroke. That's not halfway. He just takes short warm-up strokes. And notice that his elbow has not moved, and the cue tip and the entire cue is still on that line. A few more warm-up strokes, and then he pauses at the cue ball, and then the final backstroke. At the back of his backstroke, the cue is still in that line. That is, it's still in the same plane as when it was at address. And this is accomplished, no surprise, by dropping his elbow. And if you look closely, the butt of his cue has risen up just a little bit. It would need to lower a tiny bit in order to be perfectly level with that yellow line. So he would have to lower his elbow even just a little bit more to keep it on that same plane. When American players and instructors talk about elbow drop, they're almost always talking about dropping the elbow on the follow-through of the cue. But here we see the elbow lowering on the backstroke, and that's something that you almost never see in an American pool player. And in my studies, I found countless examples of professional snooker players who lower their elbow on the backstroke, just on the final backstroke, and sometimes they don't lower it at all on the final backstroke. And it kind of depends on the shot. But I was very curious, and I actually wrote to Steve Barton and asked him about this. And he said that he learned to lower his elbow on his backstroke very early in his pool career, and he does it unconsciously today on every shot. Okay, let's bring him forward to the address position. Actually, the cue ball has already been contacted, so this is a split second after address. But notice the cue is still on that line, and the elbow has returned to the address position. Now we advance to the end of the follow-through. You'll notice that his elbow has dropped. The cue is not quite level. The butt of the cue is now dipped down just a little bit. At the bottom of the screen, notice that his cue tip is not touching the cloth. In fact, the entire cue is up above the elevation that it was at address. Please know that I am not picking on Steve Barton. He has an excellent cue action. In fact, if I were to sample 100 of his strokes, I'm sure you would find minor differences between each one that really aren't noticeable unless if you slow it down on camera like this. And the same is true for myself and any other pro player that you care to name. But I think we can learn a few things from these three examples. In my opinion, the labeling of a stroke as either a pendulum or a piston stroke isn't very accurate. It's kind of limiting. All strokes are a pendulum in the sense that we swing our forearm from the elbow. But there are four types of strokes depending on whether the elbow is fixed or drops either during the backstroke or the follow-through. There's only one way to drop your elbow on the backstroke, but there's actually three different types of elbow drop on the forward stroke. Your elbow can dip just a little bit, it can drop, or there can be a total collapse. I'm inventing these three terms just for purposes of discussion in this video. Now the dip, I don't think is detrimental to your stroke. And oftentimes what looks like a small amount of dip in your elbow is simply the result of the bones moving and the cartilage and the muscles changing shape as the forearm moves. If you study pro players closely, you'll find elbow collapse to be the most rare. And if you'll compare the pictures, the big reason why is the shoulder has moved. So we're no longer swinging from the elbow. Both the upper arm and lower arm and shoulder are moving. And that's just too many moving parts to have a consistent stroke. And I'll let Steve Barton explain more precisely why it's a bad idea.
Pivot from this elbow joint instead of what you see some players do, and they do that to deliver the cue. So they'll be dropping the arm through the shot, which does move the cue forward, but it causes the cue to scoop, and it's also unreliable because you've got this moving part where your arm is moving up and down, and when that's happening, you've got to try and keep that movement right in a straight line, whereas what we're trying to do is just pivot from the elbow so that you're keeping the cue nice and straight. So that's incredibly important.
And yet, Steve's elbow has dropped in the center example. So how do we explain that? In my opinion, we need to add the topic of follow-through to the discussion, because follow-through is inextricably tied to elbow drop and arm movement. Watch this cue ball being struck in slow motion. Here's the moment of impact, and here is the end of the follow-through. I would say that's about a 4 1/4 inch follow-through, so a pretty short follow-through. Now here's another shot with a longer follow-through. Here's the moment of impact. And here's the end of the follow-through. That's about a 9 1/2 inch follow-through, so a fairly long follow-through. And now I'll show you the moment that the cue ball left the cue tip for each of those shots. Can you tell which is which? For the record, the short follow-through shot is on the right. And the difference between the length of follow-through in those images could be due simply to a microsecond difference between when the image was frozen. I know there are a lot of people who believe, as I did for many years, that having a really smooth stroke or a longer follow-through can increase the contact time of the tip on the cue ball and make for better action on the cue ball. But this isn't true. And you don't have to trust my crude experiment. Other people have put slow motion cameras on the cue ball. For example, the snooker coach Barry Stark did not find any appreciable increase in contact time with a camera that took 3,000 frames per second. So he got a camera that took 35,000 frames per second. And only then was he able to find a microscopic difference in contact time. The point of all this being, the follow-through of the cue stick has no effect on the cue ball once it's left the tip. And you might say, well, if the follow-through doesn't have an effect on the cue ball, then it doesn't have a negative effect on the cue ball. So what's the difference if I have a long follow-through? And indeed, if you look at, for example, a major league pitcher or an NFL quarterback or a pro golfer, they all have a follow-through. We have to follow through. The reason why we follow through is not to affect the cue ball. The reason for the follow-through is to ensure a smooth and accurate cue stick action before impact with the cue ball. We want the x-axis, the y-axis, and the z-axis of the cue to be identical at address as that cue ball impact. In my opinion, the best way to achieve this is with as little upper arm movement as is possible. Steve Barton's elbow drops because his chin is in the way, but it only drops on some shots. And many shots where the follow-through isn't as long, his elbow doesn't move at all. In fact, most snooker players exhibit very little elbow movement on most shots. Before I conclude and show some examples of the pros, I want to address one myth, and that's that you need a long follow-through and dropping your elbow in order to develop a powerful stroke. And I'll just show you one quick example. This is by pro player Tyler Steyer.
Oh, look at that. Wow, what a stroke.
Let's watch again in slow motion. At the very beginning of the forward movement of his cue, his elbow drops just a bit, and then all the motion through the cue ball, his elbow does not move. You can see here that the cue ball is long gone, and his elbow has not dropped at all. His cue has come to a complete stop. In fact, his hand is backed up a little bit before he just lets the momentum release the cue forward. Watch him all the way through the shot in slow motion once more. Cue power is generated by accelerating the cue around the elbow pivot point. Upper arm movement is harmful to this motion. So why does it seem to be so easy to find examples of professional pool players who drop their elbow? For one possible explanation, watch my elbow on this shot. Would you accuse me of dropping my elbow on this shot? I think it'd be fair to say yes, but let's take a closer look. First, notice that I have a very short follow-through. But remember earlier when I said that the follow-through and grip position always work as a team? Well, here's my grip position at address. My bridge is neither too short nor too long, but I believe that my forearm is forward of 90 degrees to the cue. And it might just be the camera angle, but I think it's forward of 90 degrees to the table surface. So I am swinging my cue from a fixed elbow point to the impact with the cue ball. But because the grip is forward of 90 degrees, I don't have enough room to follow through, and the swinging motion pulls the upper arm down. I am not saying that this type of elbow drop is acceptable for the player who's trying to shoot without elbow drop. What I am saying is there is a huge difference between this elbow drop and elbow collapse. There's a huge difference between swinging from the elbow with a little bit of upper arm movement versus swinging from the shoulder with upper arm movement contributing to the forward cue delivery. As we look at some examples from the pros in a moment, it's important to make note of the length of their bridge and the grip hand position, and then identify whether what you're really seeing is just a little bit of dip, whether it's a minor drop like this one, a drop that involves some shoulder movement, or a total collapse. Now let's take a look at some pros and see if we can identify exactly what's happening as they stroke the ball. Here Federgorst has a medium length bridge and his grip is 90 degrees to the cue. Notice his hand is way at the back end of his cue, although he is a taller player. I would characterize that movement as just a little dip. Here's a soft shot by Max Lechner, and again I think we're going to see just a little bit of dip. Compare that to this shot by Max. In slow motion we can see that his elbow has not dropped at impact with the cue ball, but that is a lot of movement after cue ball contact, including a little bit of shoulder movement. I don't think that's a total elbow collapse, but that's not good. And here's a big stroke by Max with a lot of elbow drop. Notice that Max's elbow does not move until after contact with the cue ball. This was a big stroke, but that upper arm movement was not necessary. Still, he did swing from the elbow, not the shoulder. Here's a power shot by world champion Ralph Souquet. I would call this a minor drop because he has a very long bridge, and yet his grip hand is at the back of the cue and it's actually behind 90 degrees to the cue. At cue ball contact, his elbow has not moved. He's swinging from his elbow, and at the finish, his elbow is only dropped a little bit incidentally. Nice job, Ralph. It is easier to shoot softly with no elbow drop, as these two shots by Mesko Fortunski show. But when he hits the ball a little harder, we see a minor drop. Next is a great example of zero elbow drop by Junglin Chang. Once again, notice a medium length bridge, and his grip hand is just a little bit behind 90 degrees, which means he can achieve a 4 to 5 inch follow through with absolutely no elbow movement and lots of room to spare, and the Q-tip finishes on the table. And another example by Chang where he hits the ball much harder but still with no elbow drop. Would you say that Alex Pegulayan drops his elbow in this shot? We can certainly criticize him for rising off the shot too quickly, but let's take a look in slow motion. The cue ball is long gone, his elbow has not dropped, and we have about 4 to 5 inches of follow through. And then we see some collapse and twisting, which Alex could surely do without. This is an example of the kind of defect in your stroke that can appear if you don't make an effort to keep your elbow still. What about this shot by Fortunski? This time you can see some upper arm rotation before cue ball contact. It's only hours and hours of practice that can make that shot accurate. And finally, how about a power draw shot by the number 1, Shane Van Boening? Now Shane has some movement, kind of a hitch in his stroke before his final delivery, but you can clearly see there is an effort to keep the elbow high and rotate from the elbow with no upper arm dropping. Here's 4 more shots by Shane played back at quarter speed. Watch his elbow. Obviously, these are just a few selected examples of thousands that I could have chosen, but I do think it shows that it is not valid to say that pros drop their elbow all the time. We can see that most pros make an attempt to not drop their elbow and to swing from the elbow and keep their upper arm motionless. Everything that I've spoken about so far in this video is what I've learned in just the last year or so. I've been playing pool for about 40 years, and what you're looking at now is me playing in 2009. And historically, I've been a big elbow dropper. I've always played with a lot of elbow movement, as you can see, and I was just trying to look like Efren Reyes. I was trying to stroke the ball smoothly, and I really didn't give any thought to my mechanics, my fundamentals, what my elbow was doing. I was just paying attention to the Q-tip. As you can see here, it's possible to play well while dropping your elbow and having other deficiencies and defects in your stroke mechanics and your stance. But I can tell you from experience that it's harder. It takes more work when you're practicing, it takes longer time to get better, and it takes more concentration on each and every shot. I've never been able to stroke the ball so well and with so much accuracy as consistently as I have recently as I've been practicing shooting without any elbow drop. If you've been searching for more consistency, more accuracy, more control, you might want to look at the relationship between your bridge length and grip location and what your elbow is doing. I hope you found that informative, entertaining, and helpful. If you did, please hit the subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. Head over to SatoriFlatRack.com and check out the promo video for my new and unique pool ball rack. And of course, ShortstopOnPool.com for my book, A Shortstop on Straight Pool. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time at Shortstop on Pool.